a 200-mile range would suit most people. A 50-mile range would suit most people on a daily basis if they could charge overnight. Say £100, 100 miles to be generous. You could easily make that car much lighter. It would use much less power. It would be much cheaper. The batteries would be smaller. It wouldn't despoil the environment so much. It would be what we should have. And those cars exist, and they're being made in China, in India, and people are using them.
Welcome to Carbon Conversations, a podcast by Biochar Life, where we explore the cutting edge of environmental solutions. From biochar to smart agriculture to the climate tech revolution, we sit down with experts and business leaders at the forefront of change. This is your host, Matt Rickard. Kimon, how are you doing? Welcome to the podcast. You were just saying it was cold, English weather.
It's -5 here, and it's one of those days when everyone's going to say, "What's this global warming all about?" Then I'm freezing.
Exactly. It's a bit of an old line, that, but people still do say it. Hey, it still does get thrown about even in politics. So,
yep.
Well, look, we've been connected through ClimateNet Mutual, a platform that I use. I know you're involved with, and Anne France, who's also been on the podcast. But I think a good starting point, just to, if you can give a bit of background on yourself, your expertise, and before we dig into any of the subject matter.
Well, I'm basically an engineer by training. I studied engineering decades ago in Cambridge, doing my best to do a general course, which isn't something that you're supposed to do. You're supposed to specialise, but I carefully specialised in mechanics and electronics and civils and structures and control. So I'm either specialist in everything or in nothing. I did a PhD on supercharging car engines. After that, stayed in Cambridge as a fellow for a few years. Went to Bristol briefly to lecture aerodynamics, then went to a university in Switzerland for 6 years, researching how to make hydraulic turbines more efficient and some fundamental aerodynamics ideas, and keeping up some car research as well. I then moved back to Cambridge following my wife's job, and found myself working as a townie here, mainly in consultancy jobs. So a bit of time playing on the edges of Formula One, some more time in automotive, quite a lot of time on medical devices, and a lot of time in companies where basically you go along to a company and say, "Tell us your problems, we're smart guys, we'll solve them for you." And you do or you don't, but you get to have a lot of fun trying to do it.
Cool. So that's, and how, and sorry if I butted in and you were going to carry on, but I'm going to ask you probably where you were going. But it's an interesting journey from all of those things into being a passionate solver of climate change issues. And I know we're going to get into some of the startup stuff, but yeah, interesting journey through Formula One, other engineering. How did you end up where you are in terms of the work you're doing around climate change, climate tech, solving the issues we have with global warming?
Well, I mean, through my career, I'm quite good at what I do technically. I can do the maths and the technical stuff as well as everyone, but I'm obviously a bit of an awkward bugger, so I struggle sometimes to find jobs. So generally, I've been following the path of whatever anyone will pay me to do, and that has led me. I mean, my first job was actually doing military research in the Ronald Reagan Star Wars days, trying to shoot down satellites. Wow. And then Formula One and then medical devices. Essentially, where is fashionable, I found myself drifting into. So it's as much pull as push. The climate change thing, though, I mean, at the moment it's very current. But I've always known, and something I do want to say is that I was 16 in 1980, and I remember then sitting around discussing climate change with people. I remember in 1982 explaining to a girl in Australia the difference between climate change and the what's it called? I've lost it now. The chlorofluorocarbons problem. The ozone layer hole. Yep. People were confusing them and saying, "Oh well, I'm changing my deodorants to solve climate change," and I say, "No, that's for the hole in the ozone layer. You're getting the wrong crisis." So I can remember that discussion. It didn't endear me to Australian girls, I have to say, but it is a way I can anchor when I knew about this quite well, and it was known in the general population. I was fairly educated, but I was still a 18-year-old. Who doesn't know this stuff? And the point of that is that I've always known and been worried about climate change, and the facts have always been out there. And I want to say that because a theme recently, every generation discovers it afresh and says, oh, well, God, why didn't they do something about it in the 80s? Why didn't they tell us? No one told me about this. I only just found out. God, it's ghastly. It's just not true. It's always been out there. You could always know if you wanted to. No one has been hiding it.
That's interesting. I mean, I grew. What was I in the? So I grew up in the kind of 80s, really. But I always remember the ozone layer, kind of issue, if you want to call it that. But because it got a lot of PR, right? But I don't remember, and certainly I can't claim to be thinking about climate change until much later. But what were the conversations at that time? Remind me, like around climate change, because the ozone layer, everyone remembered. Everyone was using aerosols, deodorants, and I think it was like with plastic straws. There's certain things that get good media, right? They become good stories to put out there, and they get hooked, or they get there's good hooks. But I don't remember the conversation in the 80s what it was, or I just may have not been switched onto it back then. But yeah.
I mean, to be fair, the general public, it wasn't obvious, but it was not a secret. I mean, I knew about it and I had no special influence. I did look back at this to try and convince myself it was true. And the landmark that most people refer to is James Hansen, of course, the famous NASA scientist who has been, arguing for this and who gave testimony to Congress in the late 80s. But he published a paper in 1981 saying climate change is going to be faster than we expect, which was very influential at the time. I do remember it being in the press. And also, the key point was he was saying, not it's this new thing I've discovered, it's coming faster than we think, implying that it was already known about it. We knew it was happening. I must admit, at school, I guess I was taught that the carbon dioxide absorbs, heat, and that this was a problem that was coming. This was the flip side of the easy use of coal and so on. The other landmark that everyone knows, of course, is Al Gore's talk in, I think it was in 2006. Again, there was a big fuss about it. People got very excited about it. Then the financial crash came along, and everyone forgot about it and rediscovered it again, maybe after COVID or before COVID or something. There's I think element to this. It comes and goes, and of course the press has a lot to do with it, and maybe politicians, because they care about today's news and they care about the next general election. And something with a long time scale like this, it is quite hard to get attention for.
You're right. That Al Gore kind of movement, if you want to call it that, which I was amazed when you just said, what did you say, 2006? Is that when it was?
I believe it was, yeah.
God, I thought it was a lot more recent, but yeah, it probably was that long ago, right? Nearly getting on for 18 years. But that seemed to be a lot shorter span. I mean, in terms of where we're at, and obviously we're on a pathway now, it seems like much less of a kind of trend in terms of talking about things. It doesn't feel like this will go away in terms of the language around it, which is great, and I'm involved in it every day. So it's kind of different when you're involved in it every day. But where would you put us in terms of what's happening now, in terms of how we're progressing, in terms of how worried we should be versus how optimistic we should be? I like to put myself on the latter side of that, but we don't necessarily have to be. Give us your kind of diagnosis, I suppose, of all those things.
Well, I mean, there are optimistic things around, and we could extricate ourselves if we were rational beings who would act for the common good, sacrifice our present for the future, and all that stuff, of course. Which evidence is that we're not. I have a graph in front of me, which, since not everyone's going to look at this screen, I won't hold up to the screen, but I will describe. It is a graph of a line. It's the carbon dioxide measurements at Mauna Kea from 1960 to present days. It's almost a straight line going upwards, slightly curving upwards. So the carbon dioxide concentration is going upwards, and it's going from 320 to 430 or something at the moment. Now, on this graph, which is essentially a curve tending to accelerate upwards, are marked the dates of the Rio climate change, 92, Kyoto, 97, Al Gore, 2006, Copenhagen, 2009, Paris, 2015. None of these made an iota of difference to the carbon concentration in the world. So we are talking a lot. We aren't actually doing very much so far as the evidence shows. I mean, maybe it would come up even faster, who knows, but there's no evidence that we're slowing down or stopping anything. It's getting worse. The more and more you can't avoid seeing evidence all around, the weather changing, floods in some places, drought in other places, the way never seen before. I lived for years in Switzerland, and there's a glacier in Switzerland where I go quite often because my uncle has a chalet there. And when I first went there in about the mid 90s, you could walk along a flat plain and touch the end of the glacier. You go there now, you walk to the end of the flat plain, and the glacier is half a kilometre above you. An enormous block of ice has just vanished. That's a simple, discrete example, but every glacier in the world almost is retreating in that way. So things are bad. It's undeniably happening. It's bad, and even if we stop emitting stuff now, we're on a lousy track. The weather's going to get worse. Sea levels are going to rise. People are going to starve, or they're going to migrate somewhere. Humanity will survive, but we've already bedded in a whole load of pain. All we can do is try and reduce the pain in the future.
Yeah, and let's that basis. No, it's good. It's good. I wanted to ask about individual contribution, but I'm going to leave that because I think it's really relevant to what you just said. But before we get into that, I mean, on that vein of, some things, there is inevitability about certain situations. We are where we're at. And we have to get on with it and do what we can, I suppose. Now, I know you've spent, a fair bit of time or you have a pretty good perspective on the kind of role of technology from a startup perspective. You've kind of, talk us through a bit of that, actually, rather than me doing a bad job of explaining. And then I'd love to dig into some of what you're seeing in terms of startups in this space.
Yes, I didn't finish my story of my background, I must admit, and I perhaps should have done. So recently, I spend a lot of time involved in two aspects of climate change, one of which is, or three really, one of which is trying to work out ways to install heat pumps efficiently in social housing in the UK, which is a nightmare problem because it's good for the climate, clearly, less CO2 emissions. The flip side is that you pay a lot of money to install your heat pump. You don't really save that much money by running it. You're essentially just paying, several £1,000s in the UK or the equivalent abroad to be good for the climate. It doesn't really pay back. I mean, you can tinker around the settings and so on and maybe save a few pounds, but it doesn't pay for itself. Things like insulation do pay for themselves. So this is one of the things I do professionally. The other thing I do is I work with a venture accelerator, which is a place where young entrepreneurs come along and they have ideas for a startup, and the accelerator matches them up with people with the skills they need. For example, a CEO with a technology specialist or an accountant or marketing person or whatever, and they try and push the idea, and then they try and go out and raise money from venture capitalists. Now, and of course, the idea is that they ultimately come up with some super invention that saves the climate, and we can all live happily ever after, driving our Ferraris. What makes this difficult is that they have to both have a startup that is venture capital fundable, which means it has to have a reasonable prospect of paying back, 4 times what you invest in it in about 3 or 4 years. This is, I'm speaking loosely, but this is what a venture capitalist expects, because most ventures fail. And it has to save a large amount of carbon. It has to work and save a lot of carbon. Now, the ways that save carbon and are financially viable are mostly done. Low energy light bulbs are an easy example. Solar panels, thermal, wind turbines, things that will save you money and save the climate. People are doing because people want to make money. So we're kind of getting to things like heat pumps where actually you have to spend a lot of money to save the climate. Having said that, I do come across a whole load of wacky ideas. And while I don't think this is the way to solve the climate crisis, and that's one of the points I want to make, I think the way to solve the climate crisis is to stop flying, stop driving, insulate our homes, move back from all the luxuries we're used to for the sake of future generations. Whether mankind will do that or not, I don't know, but that is what we should do. That would be the easy way to solve the climate change, rather than looking for this magic bullet. Having said that, the money going into these things isn't that much, and it's worth investing just in case there really is a magic bullet out there that can save us. We shouldn't rely on it, hope for it. So the kind of things I get are, for example, a whole load of remote sensing ideas, trees, forests, agriculture, building monitoring, gas emissions, all by remote sensing. Of course, these guys don't own a satellite. They're just getting a stream from somewhere, analyzing it in a new way and sending it to someone else, really, because they're startups. A lot of digital twins, so essentially really just modeling a building and trying to work out how to make it more efficient, run it better, and so on. But the jargon is cute. Digital twins is the new buzz phrase that venture capitalists like. a lot of efficient computing. The internet uses a shed load of stuff. Data centers are, are taking enormous amounts of energy. Saving 10% of that does save carbon, especially if depending where the energy comes from, of course. Quite a lot of biochar, as you all know, around. Simple things, applications for encouraging cycling, walking, and so on. How not to get lost, how to walk safely down a dangerous street, whatever it might be. A lot of carbon accounting, a lot of supply chain monitoring. Is your supplier carbon efficient or not? Should he be more efficient? Can you count their emissions to offset yours, and so on? All this kind of stuff. This offsetting thing I'm a bit dubious about because if I'm emitting carbon and I find someone else who isn't, and we collaborate, then we look good on paper. But the better thing would be for me to stop emitting, of course.
Yeah, for sure.
Some things about methane out of lakes, which is interesting, I think. A few using funguses for building materials, which is quite good because it embeds carbon as long as they stay up. A lot of people looking at seaweed, kelp, other marine type, plants that do absorb carbon. Some stuff about managing the electrical grid so that you only use electricity when the wind is blowing, so that you don't have to turn on the gas power plants. A lot of stuff about reusing car batteries. Now we have more and more electrical cars. Either at some point you can't use the batteries anymore because the range goes down, but they're still reasonably good batteries. You can either use them in solid sites, or you can break them apart and get the materials back in one way or another. A lot of stuff with the yeast, waste heat from refineries, whatever, from breweries, algae, solar for making fuel, things that are fairly well in the mainstream, really, I think. Robotic farming, robotic underwater farming, green walls for farming, energy storage, some. The big ones, electric Haber Bosch for nitrogen fixing, decarbonising carbon and steel. We get ideas for that. These are things that are extremely well known. A lot of people are working on these. Well, they sound good. Whether some small team coming out of nowhere has the magic button, I don't know really on this, but it is, if they can solve it, it's a really big contribution. A lot of recycling, a lot of putting plastic into building materials, things like that. Lots of agriculture efficiency. Lots of banking and insurance ideas, banking apps that will lend more money to green things, giving us some credit for it in some way. Insurance that will help people cope with, more floods. All sorts of agglomeration. And then, my bugbear, a lot of people that just talk about AI, blockchains, nanotubes, graphene, choose your pad. I'm mixing together apples and pears here, but
of course,
these,
yeah.
a blockchain ain't going to solve the climate. You might use it as a tool in your application, but somewhere you've got to go and grab some physical carbon and save it. And a computer program ain't going to do that by itself. What these have in common to a large extent is that as startup ideas, they're a bit like hotel.com. These guys want to make a load of money, really. Some of them care deeply about the climate. Some of them just think climate's the latest thing. Last year it was graphene, this year it's climate. So I'll get into this space because it's fashionable. But they're a bit like hotel.com in that hotel.com doesn't own any hotels. And all it does is takes a few quid off everyone who books in the hotels. And they do it on such a big scale that they're making a shed load of money. You could argue the same about Google, Facebook, and so on. Google doesn't own the websites. Amazon largely doesn't own the things it's selling. They're just taking a little bit. And all of these ideas are really piggybacking on. So if someone's put a satellite up in space, someone's got a farm. These guys think that they're going to tap on the computer and they're going to make millions out of putting them together. And they might. I don't know.
There is
that little?
No, it's good. I'm absorbing it all. Well, actually, there was one question I wanted to ask you just within that kind of smorgasbord of startups, and I get your point. I mean, at the end of the day, the startup space is not fully but typically driven by VC money, and VCs are driven by profits. And however, I think it's a great thing that money, we're seeing more and more climate tech. I mean, money going into climate tech. I think it's a great place for it to go. So I don't think there's anything negative there.
It could be somewhere else, yes, of course.
Exactly.
And many of these will make money, especially the insurance type ones, the banking, because they will make money because they will be better than the other guy doing it already, which means that they might not save that much carbon. But the money is much easier to monitor in apps like that than carbon is. You can't really prove whether your new accounting app saved any carbon very easily.
The one I wanted to ask you about was electric vehicles, because electric cars, which are obviously a huge area. You mentioned you've had some experience before this in another industry, and there's often debate, back and forth over, how what is the impact of these, or how long do they have to be, in service before there is an impact because of batteries, because of, I mean, you have all the social issues as well, the negative social impact issues of I've forgotten the name of the heavy metal that comes out of what's the main heavy metal for the battery?
Niobium, cadmium, which yttrium.
The other one, anyway,
Just
cobalt,
lithium.
cobalt.
Yeah.
Sorry, cobalt. But which was not the part I was talking about. But and if I put you on the spot here and it's not your expert area, please just tell me. But yeah, as you are an engineer, as you did talk Formula One, and you just mentioned electric vehicles, I'm interested to hear your perspective on, should we all be moving to an electric vehicle? How important is it? What are the good? What's the good? What's the bad?
It unfortunately is my expert area, so you're
Okay,
going to
cool.
regret asking me because I could speak for England for years on it.
Go for it.
I gave a presentation which is plug here on the Climate Link site if you have to be a Climate Link member about my views on various things. The electric cars are essentially a good thing, but they're a step on the way. A good friend of mine is the head of Daimler-Benz research into new technologies in North America. Did a PhD with me, and he was rather more successful technically, and he shot off his high level. And he came around and chatted, and I said to him, I'm surprised that people are still talking about hydrogen cars, because in the 80s we all talked about fuel cells, hydrogen cars. They've largely vanished off the scene. It's all become electrical. And he said, well, I'm glad they are, because we all know that electrical isn't the answer. The issues you raise are perfectly valid, and the social costs, environmental costs, in terms of despoiling the environment, in terms of modern slavery and whatever, in making the batteries, of course, are wildly significant. But this is a separate problem from climate change, and I'm going to say, Bruce, you've got to choose your problem. Modern slavery and exploitation of workers happens, in fashion, in all sorts of fields. That isn't the problem I'm trying to fight, although I'm absolutely for fighting it. The cars, electric vehicle evolution has been quite interesting. If you're of a certain generation, you might remember the C5, which was essentially looked like a little soapbox that you sat in, had an electric motor. It would do 20-mile range and it would do 15 miles an hour. It was a lethal looking thing. I wouldn't go on the road.
Early 80s, right? I do remember. I think it was yeah.
That was ultimately used hardly any power. It would get you around. If there were no cars on the road, that would be the way to go.
Yeah.
If the opposite extreme now is a Tesla, the latest Tesla weighs about 1.8 tons, about I don't know 800. Getting on for half of that is battery weight. So you're using all that power to move the batteries around, especially if you just and a driver is 70 kilos. So think about that: 2 tons driving around, 2,000 kilos to move 70 kilos of driver. Typically one driver in the car. It does 400 miles or 394 miles. It will do 160 miles an hour. No one needs a 160 mile an hour supercar, to be blunt. You could make it, a 200-mile range would suit most people. A 50-mile range would suit most people on a daily basis if they could charge overnight. Say 100 miles to be generous. You could easily make that car much lighter. It would use much less power. It would be much cheaper. The batteries would be smaller. It wouldn't despoil the environment so much. It would be what we should have. And those cars exist, and they're being made in China, in India, and people are using them. There was I don't know what it's called. There was an Indian car that tried to be imported to Britain, and everyone laughed at it, but it was, it was legally, it was a tricycle or something, and it was small and flimsy, and it looks like you get crushed. Whereas the Tesla, of course, looks like a modern American car. You feel great. I'm invincible in this car, no one's going to hurt me. And a lot of problem, of course, is this American idea you need a big SUV so that if you have a crash, the other guy dies, not you. But if we all had small cars that would do 200 miles and needed maybe a quarter of the battery weight, maybe it could do 60 or 70 miles an hour, we'd all be far better off. Equally, of course, we should all go to public transport. But nevertheless, they are saving fuel. And so they are overall a good thing. The defense of Tesla is that it's an entry it's bringing up the market, it's making people aware and making it successful to have an electric car. I can't dispute that. But it's not the way the future should be. It's the small, cheap electric vehicles, electric motorbikes as well that you see coming more and more. Electric scooters are everywhere now.
Cool.
But it isn't the solution, because the problem is you're carrying around all that weight of battery, and it takes energy to accelerate it and decelerate it, and you recover some of the energy, but not all. So lighter, smaller, it is better.
Cool. There is ultimately no kind of silver bullet here in terms of fixing the, fixing the whole problem. And going back to what you said before, you talked about all these startups. You gave you started to give your view on the solution, which I'd love to hear, because it's dramatic. And you talked about we stopped flying. I mean, is it that? Do you see it as that dramatic? If we want to fix this, I mean, is that how you see this situation realistically?
It would have been easier in the 70s or 80s to stop it, because to invest in technologies, we could now have all electric cars, electric trains. I mean, flying famously is about 4 or 5% of emissions, so it isn't the answer, but it's both totemically visible. It's an extremely inefficient way of traveling. If we had a dictator whose ambition was to make sure that humanity survived as long as possible in the future, and as few people died or were flooded or were in drought situations or agriculture failed in various places, then you would cut down on all of that stuff. And we would essentially have to consume less energy. Most of the stuff is energy. So insulate homes, have smaller homes, have more compact cities, so that you don't have to travel, so that you can walk to the dentist, walk to your work, or take public transport, walk to public transport, rather than need a car. I'm sitting in Cambridge, where I can, to be honest, cycle anywhere I want. There are cities in Europe where I've lived or been, where you can walk to public transport and get anywhere you like by public transport. There are bigger cities, and I'm going to pick on Americans again, where it's impossible to get beyond your own block without a car, because there's no way to cross the road. And apart from that, the nearest shopping mall is a mile away, and you can't carry your groceries that far, or 2 miles away, or 5 miles away.
Yeah.
So a lot of this stuff has to change. But what it comes down to is a massive change in our lifestyles. I mean, what people mean by standard of living is a bit subjective. You might think being able to sit at home, read a book all day is a great standard of living, but most people regard this as a massive lowering of standard of livings, and I kind of agree. Particularly the ability to go on holiday, and my kids who are late teenagers, and their generation, let's say, not to pick on my kids because they might watch this, they are very aware and upset about climate change. They blame us for despoiling the climate in past generations, and they think nothing of flying to Berlin for a weekend of clubbing, because it only costs £50 to buy a plane ticket to Berlin and back, and it's cheaper than going to London. So there's something mad about the way that it is all priced and working at the moment. A great frustration to me is that trains are so expensive compared with flying, and I've spent a long time discussing this with people in the plane industry. The trouble is, it just costs more to run a train than a plane at the moment, partly because aviation gas isn't even taxed. Never mind bandit.
And you're talking. I don't know. I mean, I assume it's specifically a UK problem, but it does bemuse me completely when I look at. I'm just booking a UK trip at the moment, and I'm looking at train tickets, and I mean, it's insanity. The cost of traveling from one side of the country to the other for 3 hours, Bristol to London. But anyway, that's probably a whole other debate there, which is not relevant. I don't know, but yeah.
The UK is mad. Unfortunately, with a train, you have to have a driver, you have to have, thousands of miles of concrete, you have to have, people collecting tickets, you need to maintain the things. It is just inherently expensive compared with, tarmac of 2 miles of concrete either end and a plane.
So maybe a segue to a kind of closing question, and you did kind of allude to it there a little bit in what you were saying, but what advice do you give to people? Because I started off talking about optimism versus pessimism. There is a reality of where we're at, what we got to do, or what we can do, but what do you advise in terms of, the individual that's kind of concerned, worried, wanting to make a change? Because it is also so nuanced, right? And where people live. I mean, I live in the north of Thailand. I mean, it's completely different here, obviously, to there. But how to advise and what advice? I know that's a pretty wide, big question, but
okay, I want to make an optimistic point as well about somewhere I've been recently. If
yeah,
you allow me.
go for it.
Yeah. The answer to that question is I'm not sure that individual action is really the thing. I mean, I try not to drive when I don't have to. I try not to do too much. But, I've just flown to Turkey and back this week. I'm flying to Switzerland to go skiing next week. I'm the total hypocrite. I have a big house here, which is quite badly insulated, and I do heat it with gas. I know many people who don't, and I admire them greatly, but I think that the people that can afford to and want to are willing to spend their own money to save the climate. It's helpful. It isn't the answer. So think who you vote for. Go out in public, say, yes, we will vote for less climate change, advocate. In the end, I believe it has to be a government in the end. The UN process has to wake up, move away from oil, petrochemical, petrostates, go somewhere that cares and get some teeth at last. In fact, they took them 30 years after Rio to say that we should stop burning fossil fuels or consider using less fossil fuels is an outrage. They've got to get there. Yeah. That's the only real global scale. Otherwise, everyone will say, oh, well, look at China, look what they're doing, and therefore we won't do anything. But I did on Monday go to visit a waste tip in Turkey, in a mid-sized city, a place about 300 meters across. It takes municipal waste, about 90 tons a day. The company I'm consulting for, or may consult for, does it essentially gathers methane. So they have gone in there, they put tubes through all the waste and sealed it, and they also gather the organic waste, put it organic waste, and they are, from this relatively small site, they're generating a shed load of methane. They're selling millions of pounds worth of electricity in the place. It's 5 or 6 million pounds, I don't know the exact number, but of that order, constantly from a relatively small rubbish tip. It's just wet. And what's nice is you can go and stand there and you can hold the pipe where the methane that is being pumped out and is being saved from being emitted is flowing. You feel it humming. Yeah. And there tangibly is, the climate being helped. There are things that work, and this is one of them. And, I tend to be jaded, so you're going to say, oh, well, that won't, it's not worth bothering with, is it? But when you go there and see it and touch it, see it being used, you think, we can do this. There are things that do work as well.
That's a good story, and that's a very cool solution. And I think you're often, going back to your comment on VCs, the funny thing is, if you can find the profit in the problem, it's doing good, it's making money. You tend to get a lot more people engaged in the solution, which is always handy. Yeah. Cool. I didn't have anything else to ask. However, if there is anything I didn't ask or anything else you'd like to share, please go ahead. And otherwise, where can people find you if they want to learn more or get in contact?
I'm fairly reclusive on social media, I'm afraid. I decided that I would spend my whole life on it because I'm an addictive character if I ever got on. So I don't really. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm Kimon R is my name at LinkedIn, or you go presumably somewhere on this. My name will be there. I'm the only Kimon Roussopoulos in the world. I'm one of the few Kimon in the world.
I will.
In fact, so people can find me via LinkedIn.
It's definitely not a name that I've heard before. So, but I will put the link it'll be in the speaker notes. So I'll put your name and also link to your LinkedIn if you're happy with that. And interesting to chat. I sense over a coffee or a glass of wine, I could get into some really interesting chats around some of the startups in the engineering and other solutions that you've seen or continue to see. So, appreciate you joining.
I would love to do it face to face. Unfortunately, one of us would have to fly. We'll become a climate criminal. But I'm such an evil criminal already that I'm willing to do that to meet you.
Awesome, Kimon. Well, enjoy your day. I hope it warms up. I say in inverted commas and with a bit of a joke, but I hope it warms up, but it also cools down. If you get my meaning. But all the best.
Indeed.
Cheers.
Yeah, pleasure to talk to you.